Continuing debate, the honourable member for Lakeland.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Before I start, I just want to extend my condolences to the Cossey family who farmed down the road where I grew up near Chipman for the loss of their beautiful Veronica, a much-loved, well-known and universally admired nurse, farm wife, and community member from Lamont County. I appreciate this opportunity to stand up for people like the Cosseys and people all across Lakeland and for hardworking farmers and agricultural workers across Alberta and throughout Canada against the rising costs brought on by the NDP Liberal Costly Coalition's carbon tax. Thank you so much to my Conservative colleagues, the MP for Huron-Bruce who brought in this bill, and the member from Northumberland Peterborough South who introduced it as C206, which was agreed to before the Liberals called the unnecessary 2021 election, which put it back to square one and blocked this crucial relief for farmers from the carbon tax on their farm fuels for the past 2 years. I'm proud to represent all kinds of farms, ag businesses, and farming families across Lakeland, the fourth largest rural riding in Alberta. It's home to 9 First Nations and Métis communities and more than 50 municipalities and summer villages, and it takes almost an hour to drive from end to end. Lakeland's economy mainly relies on agriculture, natural resources, and small businesses. I hope colleagues from urban and suburban ridings can begin to imagine the distances, infrastructure challenges, equipment required, and costs involved in the daily lives and work of the people and businesses across an area larger than 86 countries around the world, especially for those family farms and related businesses that make a living off the land, who feed the world with the highest environmental and production standards of any farmers on planet Earth. Where I'm from, while lots of us use Skylink now for internet, you still can't haul cattle or seed a crop with a Tesla, and almost none of the towns have public infrastructure and transportation. It's in these rural areas that Canadian farmers live and work to feed their neighbours and cities. As one of the world's largest producers of canola, oats, wheat, flaxseed, and pulse crops, the 5th largest agricultural exporter in the world, Canada's agriculture sector accounts for almost 7% of GDP and sustains the livelihoods of 2.4 million Canadians. It's vital. Farmers are the backbone of Canadian rural communities. They work hard days and late nights to put food on our tables. Canadian farmers compete with each other and globally, so they constantly innovate for the most efficient production of crops and livestock to maintain, improve, and steward the land, the water, the air on which their lives literally entirely depend. They strive to reduce costs and offer high-quality but affordable products. But despite their generations of excellence in environmental stewardship and emissions reduction, the Liberals slapped them with an ever-growing carbon tax. Farmers now struggle to provide for their families, maintain their businesses, contribute to their communities, and pass on their way of life. Constituents often share personal trials and tribulations, and my dedicated staff and I work as best we can to solve the problems we can impact. We all agree some of the most heartbreaking conversations are in farmyards or in the constituency office, where farmers, some whose roots stretch back so far they have awards that celebrate more than a century of their families' blood, sweat, tears, and work, painfully say they've resigned themselves to hope their kids don't try to take it on and to pick a different path because the costs are insurmountable. But no wonder when some farmers will face $150,000 a year in taxes just 7 years from now if the Liberals stay on course. Canadian farmers and ag-based communities have faced major challenges in recent years as collateral damage and trade wars and diplomatic disputes, which makes the normal uncertain weather and growing conditions and global prices even worse. Back-to-back disasters have hit Lakeland with alternating harvests from hell and then major flooding when farmers lost a significant portion of their crops, some completely wiped out, and so other farmers ran out of grazing area and feed for their livestock. Farmers have clearly asked for one thing: to axe the expensive and unfair carbon tax so they can continue to feed Canadians and the world. Michelle, a farmer from Blackfoot, says that carbon tax hikes are, quote, crippling. She says, quote, in my opinion, the Federal Minister of Agriculture is not taking this issue seriously. Farmers already have to navigate challenging conditions and carefully plan and save so they don't go bankrupt during bad years. When rural families have to watch their once-a-year paycheck burn, drown, rot, freeze on the field, or get loaded for processing because they can't afford to feed all year, or the costs for grain drying and heating barns are skyrocketing and too expensive, situations that are completely out of their control, the government shouldn't use a tax to make it worse and take even more away. Unfortunately, the Liberals' approach to farmers and farm families is mostly broken programs, endless platitudes, and at worst, layers of punitive policies and outright hostility to their way of life. In 2016, the Ag Minister said the Liberals wouldn't exempt farmers from the carbon tax because, quote, the impact is a very small percentage of operating costs. Frankly, this is not reality for farmers and ranchers and rural Canadians. Farmers need specialized, expensive equipment powered by fuels that have no alternative to grow and harvest their crops, irrigate, and heat barns and buildings. The carbon tax will cost the average farmer $45,000 a year overall, estimates of $36,000 a year for grain drying alone. And the worst part is Liberals were warned, but they ignored the CFIB's analysis that farmers would already pay an average of $14,000 a year in federal carbon taxes when it was just $20 in 2019. The Liberals hiked it 150% a year ago, and days from now, the Liberals will triple that carbon tax compared to 2019. Talk about the worst April Fool's joke ever. It's not just Conservatives saying the carbon tax will cost more. The independent, nonpartisan PBO confirms it's a net loss for most Canadians. The truth is that 60% of all households pay more than they get back, rising to 80% in Ontario and Alberta by next year. The average Canadian family pays an extra more than $400 and more than $800 in those provinces in carbon tax this year after Liberal rebates. Farmers and ranchers, of course, will pay even more, but Michelle from Blackfoot is right. The Liberals don't care about the disproportionate damage of their carbon tax for rural Canadians and producers. And it's even more galling the Liberals refuse to reverse course when almost half of Canadians are $200 away from bankruptcy and food prices are skyrocketing, so Canadians are already skipping meals, turning down the heat, or cutting out meat and veggies to make ends meet because of the Liberals' reckless tax and inflationary spending agenda. The Liberals' rebate program, which they claim is an offset, is really just a blanket return to producers, which is entirely based on eligible farming expenses that need to total over $25,000 to qualify. It ignores the distinct impacts of carbon surcharges on particular farms, sector productivity, and competitiveness. The carbon tax affects the entire supply chain. It makes it more expensive for farmers to produce food and more expensive to ship it, which raises the cost of groceries for all Canadians. In many cases, farmers are so cash-strapped, they also can't afford any more capital-intensive innovations and technologies for productivity and sustainability gains. Well, that's the exact opposite of what carbon tax proponents claim they want. A chicken producer and mixed farmer from Lakeland, Ross, recently said to me in exasperation, "What does the Prime Minister want me to do? Use coal or just quit farming?" Obviously, a full carbon tax exemption for natural gas and propane, lower emitting, more affordable and actually available fuels would make a real difference for farmers struggling to pay their bills. But Liberals don't listen to everyday Canadians, Conservatives, or apparently even their own public servants. They impose policies with arbitrary and impossible targets without a second thought to how it will hike costs for everyone and hurt some even more. Of course, the Liberal government's own studies long warned of the major added costs of the carbon tax for farmers and all Canadians. In 2015, Finance Canada said imposing a carbon tax would, quote, cascade through the economy in the form of higher prices, leading all firms and consumers to pay more. That prediction came true. The Lloydminster Ag Exhibition Association also says the carbon tax is crippling and, quote, too much of a burden. Their bill is already $30,000 a year in carbon tax alone. Their building got major energy retrofits, but the carbon tax still hiked bills 30% and taxed away any cost savings. But Liberals are happy to add disproportionate costs to farmers, farm families, and rural residents. It's not where their votes are, even while the carbon tax causes all economic pain and no discernible environmental gain. Ultimately, all Canadians, farmers, workers, consumers, business owners, the middle class, people on fixed incomes, the working poor, urban residents, all consumers, anyone who eats, pays this price. So Conservatives will axe the carbon tax completely. But today, we will axe that tax completely. But today, we can at least exempt farmers from the carbon tax on fuels they can't do without, for which there are no alternatives to affordably or immediately replace, and save them tens of thousands of dollars a year on necessary farming costs and operations. I want to thank again our Conservative colleague from Huron, Bruce, for giving us this common sense opportunity to turn hurt into hope for Canadian farmers. I'm proud of the agricultural sector in Lakeland and all across the country. I'm grateful for all the farmers and producers, their families, and their workers. That's why I support Bill C-234 and encourage all MPs who claim to stand with Canadian farmers and ranchers to do the same. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.